All right, and we are live, I believe. Okay, so I'm Dave Greggs, right under the provisional nom de plume for Christmas night. And I've got the honor and the privilege of interviewing Patrick Stuart today, who's got a Kickstarter in the works for Demon Bone Sarcophagus, which is the first phase of the upcoming adventure series Broken Fire Regime, which he's created and conceptualized with Scrap Princess. Patrick?
Hello, I'm Patrick Stuart. I wrote a bunch of D&D books like Veins of the Earth, Deep Calm Observatory, and I am here to pour myself out about my new Kickstarter. So if you want to Google that, Demon Bone Sarcophagus or Patrick Stuart or False Machine or Scrap Princess, it should show up. And also to talk about beauty and aesthetics with David.
Sweet. Okay, so just before we dive into it, I just want to say I'm not going to be a big fanboy because I think it's probably alienating, but I just Patrick's work has inspired me for a long time. He's one of my favorite living prose artists, and so this is a huge treat and a huge honor. Okay, so now I'm going to ask questions in the order that they, more or less in the order that they occurred to me. Maybe that's a proxy for actual interest or something, we'll see, or maybe what needs to be asked. But so starting out, so the tomb in Demon Bone Sarcophagus, I want to ask you about how you conceptualize the architecture of it, or how you laid out the architecture, if you're thinking about architecture played into it at all.
Oh, well, that's kind of embarrassingly simple. So one of the basic symbols of fire is the fire triangle, which you may know of, which is, I think it's fuel, oxygen, and heat. And that's if you're teaching anyone about fire, that's where you start with. You teach them, it's like Firefighter 101. You want to limit the amount of fuel, limit the oxygen, limit the heat. You get rid of all those, you get rid of the bit of the fire. And the theme of Broken Fire Regime is unsurprisingly fire. And the nice thing about triangles is if you tessellate them as a room or a series of rooms, they make a nice, neat, larger triangle. And you have 3 entries and exits to each room. So it made sense for me that the people who are into this culture would adopt triangles as a symbol. It fits into some problem-solving elements in the tomb, and it means that I don't have to think too much about the shapes of rooms, but just about the contents. So the tomb and the tombs, you'll find some later on in the series of this culture, are all triangles made of triangles, like a triangular base made of small triangles equal. And so it kind of reminds you a bit of old movie Cube, where you go into a different room, everything's the same shape and size, but the contents are different. And that was my basic concept, and it was simple. So I started with that and then started adding more weird stuff like semi-collapsed rooms and tunnels in between them and different kinds of activity to kind of dirty it up.
Makes sense. Okay. So I want to ask you about if you've integrated anything like related to Arthurianism or knights into Demon Bone Sarcophagus, or more particularly maybe palaces of fire down the line, like your knowledge about the corpus and, you know, general, does that factor into any of your content in DBS?
Basically, yes. I wasn't expecting anyone to ask this for like a couple of years, but the part of the access to the whole series is that you encounter 2 very different cultures. You do the dungeon crawl and you go into a thing called Frictionless blue glass, which is where you encounter like a mercantile corporate plantation culture, which is based almost entirely around dehumanization, depersonalization, and atomization. So everyone, including the villains, is basically highly replaceable, and it's a world of structures and roles, but no like humanity. And then you go to Palaces of Fire, hopefully, and you encounter another culture, but this one's the complete opposite. It's highly feudal, hierarchical, noble. It's all about dueling, personal honor, and where in Frictionless Blue Glass, you're just encountering systems which have people kind of briefly inhabiting them, but you could swap out the people and the system would remain. In Palaces of Fire, everything is about the personal, and the systems don't matter that much compared to like, it's a journey. It's like a court drama or an investigation or a dueling catastrophe in between these highly individuated persons with complex personalities and deep like interconnections. And one of the dangers of one of the fail states of the whole thing is that it's possible for the culture in Palaces of Fire to basically go into an Arthurian death spiral. So there's the thing in honor cultures where you have an unending series of feuds. Like one person kills someone and they accidentally kill like a beloved child of another clan. The second clan is like, well, we have to take revenge. They take revenge and do a bit extra. The first clan is like, well, now we need to take revenge because we can't, even if they don't want to, they have to, because in an honor culture, you have to illustrate that you're willing and able to do harm. It's your only real source of safety. So they take revenge, and then the whole thing just keeps going and escalating, and you end up with a serious system where everybody destroys everybody else. Even though they kind of know it's going to happen, they can't break out of that cycle without surrendering their basic sense of self and their basic sense of morality. So that's one thing that can happen in Palaces of Fire. And that's basically the end of the Arthurian cycle, which is what happens with Arthur and Gawain and Lancelot, where Arthur's marriage goes tits up. He takes Guinevere prisoner. Lancelot attacks, accidentally kills one of the only family members he really loves. Gawain flips out. Now, Gawain and Arthur are flipping out, so they go and beat up Lancelot. Lancelot fights back, and then basically the two sides, as the two sides destroy each other, and Mordred turns up to consume the remains. But it was a potentiality implicit in the nature of the culture they were creating. It took a great deal of scheming and creativity for Arthur and his close circle to stop the honor culture he created to get out of chaos from turning into an unending cycle of violence on its own. It's kind of the inherent tragedy of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it always seems like warlord poetry or fiction, stuff like that, as opposed to later chivalric stuff, is very, very gangster. Like a lot of it, wouldn't be, I don't know, I guess they kind of presage things like Game of Thrones or whatnot, but wouldn't be out of place in the annals of a police blotter, in the way that people relate to each other and how they conduct themselves.
Like I think I've read a few books, and if you compare like say Appalachian mountain communities and proto-Arthurian knightly clans and gangster groups and prison gangs, they all basically work on the same general principle, which is there's no inherent order, so the only order is your loyalty to your clan, and if there's even the perception that you've been threatened, you have to make a response, because only the general belief that you're capable of making a strong response keeps anyone safe. So you have to be almost preemptively violent just to keep yourself secure. And then you have like that problem of internecine feuding, and then you have to basically occasionally end up with a lot of old gangsters or old prisoners or old knights or old Appalachian group mountain men coming down from the mountain and saying to a bunch of younger men, you have to stop doing this for reasons. And often the reason they bring in is some kind of vague quasi-religious thing. They need something from outside their moral schema to stop the cycle from just going on and on and on.
Right.
Same with Pashtuns, I think. They had a principle where they had like an imam or something, or like a weird mystic would come down out of the mountains and say, it's the will of Allah, you have to stop, and I can prove this with magic or prophecy. And then everyone's like, everyone kind of wants to stop already, but now they're like, well, there's magic and prophecy, so we can stop killing each other. Interesting.
It's like having built-in missionaries in your own culture and shape things in a less internecine direction. Yeah, I've often thought that a lot of the extreme brutality that you hear about, like medieval torture, that kind of conduct, probably stems from, well, like you were saying, the need for deterrence, but then also fear, of being assassinated or poisoned, of your enemies who you defeat one day coming back and charging you down another day. And so when you actually get your hands on somebody, all that comes out, and it's like a cat, exercising its tensions or something like that.
And it has to be public as well, because there aren't any big systems of communication, or they aren't as good. So people know what they see, and what they see needs to be you avenging yourself or reasserting order physically on someone's body, because they're not going to forget that. And so you kind of have to make an example out of people, whether that's in a relatively gentle way, like pillaring, or whether it's insanely extended, mad tortures for people who, say, attack the king or something. I think there's a record of one of the last breakings of the wheel that took place in France, and some of the way people talk about it is tripped out. They're talking about it almost as if it's some kind of spiritual experience, as if it's beautiful, as if the horror and the extremity of what's been done to a human body is like compelling and beautiful within itself, or horrific to the point where it reaches the divine. There's some strange language used. Those are not like, well, that's a part of us that we're not that familiar with at the moment, and it's difficult to wrap your head around it, but difficult for me to do so.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's I don't think that like heightened heightened states of awareness that should send your limbic system into overdrive, probably not all positive. Okay, so this actually segues pretty nicely into my next question here, which was about frictionless blue glass, which I always want to say bluegrass. So I remember hearing that your conceptualization of the eighth at all from veins of the earth sprung in part from the way people in antebellum times sort of felt or try to justify what they were doing. And I was wondering if like your research into that or what you've heard or read factored into how you conceptualized sort of like the main substratum that you, or stratum that you encounter in frictionless blue glass.
Yes, it actually directly did. So in frictionless blue glass, a lot of the basic material operations of the plantation are based on Jamaican sugar plantations, the very first ones, which had, imagine like several kinds of bad combined. It's like boiling sugar is not safe for anyone to be around. And if the people you're employing are basically disposable, it gets much worse. So there were like nightmarish situations with like vats of sugar falling over, people falling into vats of boiling sugar, lots of people with lost limbs and cauterized wounds and so on. Burns are like rough. So that central industrial process is like at the core of what the company in frictionless blue glass is doing. And then building out from that, the level of personal alienation and replaceability, it combines like a bunch of different nightmare scenarios from different periods of corporate horror. So the primal basis is like slaves brewing sugar on a plantation where everyone's basically just a meat machine and they're expendable. And the next layer up is royally from the late 20th century, early 24th, where everyone's kind of atomized and kind of no one really knows each other. People know their roles. And it feels like anyone, it's kind of like I felt working in call centers where anyone can be replaced at any time. You look over, there's someone else doing their job, and it doesn't matter because the job is all that really matters. And that is true all the way up the line. So the lower level staff can be replaced, but the constant churn of the company means that the upper level staff can also be replaced. And the company itself is this other thing, which just uses people temporarily, even very high status people. It just picks them up. And then once they're worn out, chucks them. And this very process of alienation creates a certain cast of mind, a certain kind of personality, and it changes people, brings out some characteristics and alters others, so that over time, it kind of creates a personality that fits within its own structure. And you get people who are made to be this way and who are good at it. And then the top level, which is how it relates to the rest of the world, is really more like a 19th century, early late 18th century like merchant company, like the East India Company or something, where this group of merchants have a lock on this particular product, this particular market, and they're just being fully mercantile and just rinsing it as hard as they can and don't really care about anything else. Like they're not connected to any government because so for the first time they're above or beyond governments. They're not deeply connected to the process of it being made because everyone involved in that is replaceable and it's far away. So they're basically just, everyone involved in it is kind of just interested in this tiny individual part. They're maximizing their benefits and using whatever power they can to sustain it. And the whole situation is just kind of an invisible nightmare that no one powerful person is directly connected to.
So this is a question that came to me while you were discussing that, which is, when and this is kind of like a personal question, when you write these, or when you write and read about very, very dark things, where you know that the people involved didn't really have a chance of escape, or not a likely one anyways, does it burden you for a while after you encounter the information for the first time, or go to a place where you're generating that kind of content?
Yes, a bit, but less so. It's like basically reading about it for the first time is mildly distressing. I wouldn't say burdened, I would say it sticks in my mind. The position, it's kind of nightmarish if you think too deeply about it. So I'm simultaneously drawn towards it and repelled, which is normal. It would be laughable for me to say I was traumatized by reading any of it because it's comparing it to the people who went through it. But it does kind of shift my moral awareness of like reality and how bad things can get. And the troubling element is how deeply, the question you always have to ask when you're looking at someone else in a really bad historical situation is, if I were there, or if that was normal to me, given the culture I was given and my capabilities, would there be anything realistic I could or would do about it? And there are some people like that. There's a French noble who ends up, after the revolution, he ends up on his family's plantation in Haiti, I think. And he's a normal person to begin with. He's not like liberal in this one sense. And he's like largely fine with the race divide, but he's not like super sociopathic. He doesn't enjoy torturing people. And he doesn't think like murdering or making people paupers or torturing them is good. And he knows that's what he's essentially doing. And he's bound into it. So he knows he's enmeshed in evil. He knows he's doing things that are against God, and he tries to talk himself through it, but he keeps running up against the fact that if he were to change it, he would effectively be destroying his family's remaining wealth and sending the rest of his family into penury, because this horrible situation is keeping his family afloat. And if he goes full revolutionary and says, in my nobility, I will no longer take advantage of any other human being, and it definitely won't be like burning, mutilating, and terrorizing them. You stop terrorizing them, they're going to stop working because they don't want to do what you're asking them to do. In practical sense, you could say someone else evil might take it over, but in the immediate sense, you take advantage of slavery, or your family goes boom down several status groups. They'd still survive, but they wouldn't be noble anymore, and they'd be like struggling to get by, and that would be on you. So, like, how much of a hero do you think you are? Like, probably not that much. And I found it to be a very difficult situation. I would be, I wondered if I were there in the room with him and I could tell him what I know from the future, what arguments I could use to persuade him, but I haven't been able to come up with anything really good because I can't unwind the central problem at its core.
Yeah. Okay. So
but I can in a game, because in the game you can win and the magical things can happen. So
yeah, that's what's magic. Not the magic in the game, but the way that you can get in the middle of these things and try and see what your own perspective is. So I wasn't gonna mention this, but just because of the way you laid that out, I was kind of struck. I was like, with the darkness thing, I thought of that because I read a story recently where the main character's in a children's hospital and it gets bombed. He's got a moment of like absolute panic and horror and desperation, and he's like, you know, like, what can I actually do now? And this is in like the swirling darkness where I can't even breathe because it's pulverized for rock. And then when you were talking about the noble thing, and that, I mentioned that because when I wrote that scene, I tried to get in the shoes and it burdened me for like a few days. You know, not traumatized, but just burdened, like emotionally burdened. Looking into that as deeply as I could. And then the other thing is a story about a noble whose family, he doesn't realize it's going to be this way, but his family asks him to traffic heroin, and about his own conceptualization of his nobility weighed against the willing participation of his house in this after he starts to see what it actually does to people. So anyways, just had to mention that because it's just like strikingly parallel, I guess.
It is.
Okay, so
I guess the equivalent for a modern person would be basically drone wars, factory farms, and selenium mines, where it's like, we all probably have a vague sense that they're bad, but realistically, what are you going to do? And it's like, you should probably do some things, but you're probably not going to do that many things. You're not going to abandon your mobile phone because you don't like the way they mine selenium. You can probably stop eating McDonald's, but drone wars might be beyond your capacity. So yeah, kind of a dark schema. Yeah, I try to avoid in my like actual personal philosophy. I try not to dive into like Cormac McCarthy land where everything is doomed and you can just, it's like the Old Testament, you can just choose dooms, but yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, definitely. It's easy to see the blind spots of people in other times, but I'm sure we've got, you know, many of it. You know, maybe are understandable for our time, but are going to be apparent and commented on in 1,000 years. Okay, so I want to ask you about sort of like base or the feed in reading that went forward into Demon Bone Sarcophagus, as in what books maybe informed Demon Bone Sarcophagus that either informed your previous work or are new for Demon Bone Sarcophagus and sort of like unique to it?
Okay, so this is unfortunate because there's one. Okay, so there's relatively little writing about fire available, purely as like it's on its own. So if you want to write about like earth, there's a lot, and if you want to write caves, there's a lot. I haven't done like air and water yet, but I assume there's probably more. But fire is either relatively unstudied, or it's like it's not like something that a lot of people have written a lot about. So one of the most useful periods of like knowledge and thinking to look up when you're making like fancy D&D or like whatever art punk is like the just pre-modern, like just before like the 18th century, when there's enough scientific method that people are thinking in coherent chunks of data that you can grasp, but they don't know what's going on, and their heads are full of all kinds of complex sensory information. So you've got like situations like the British Navy doing an experiment where to see if sympathetic magic works on dogs and if they can use wounding dogs to calculate longitude, which I think people actually did, or at least it was proposed. And it's hard to find those original texts, but one person who did write about that period a lot about fire is a guy called Gaston Bachelard, who is like the French philosopher, and he wrote a book called, I think it's called The Semiotics of Fire. And my agonizing relationship is, he did a deep dive into all of these kind of early modern or medieval viewpoints of what fire is and all of these strange beliefs that people had about them. His thesis was that, I think it was fire represents, I don't know exactly what his thesis was. He was basically pointing out how deeply influenced people's view of fire was by their immediate psychology. I didn't really like Gaston Bachelard at all. I kind of found his writing, his opinions, his theories mendacious, but his investigation was fascinating. And in going through all of these amazing, weird, old ideas about what fire is, like, is it alive? Does it breed? Does fire have children? It kind of grows and dies. Does it have gender? Is it made of little animals? Are there tiny little fire sprites, like bacteria or something? We don't know. So everyone has these like these wild concepts, which you can't, with your natural senses, prove are wrong, or you need like a lot of science to do them. But I dislike Gaston Bachelard's book so much that I sent it to a friend a long time ago after taking as many notes as stuff that interested me. So a lot of the ideas that went into the conceptualization of fire come from information in that book, which I now can't locate because I gave it away because I didn't like the writer. But at least in Broken Fire Regime as a whole, the idea of fire is having 3 genders, and the male gender being related to earth and volcanoes, the female gender being related to sky and lightning, and another bit gender being like natural fires. I think that comes from I think I found in Bachelard, and that happens that's kind of written through the entire series a little bit, but really comes out at the end. The Demon Bone Sarcophagus itself, goddamn, I don't know. I think I kind of drew from my general idea store for that. I think it's a pretty classic Patricky dungeon with a bit of deep time, a bit of like ancient sculptures that tell you secrets, random monster, weird tomb guardians, but it's kind of similar in tone to DCO, but it's not as deeply themed as Deep Calm and Preserved was, because it's just like a starter. Most of the things that are deeply interesting about it relate to the culture that it's from, which you find out more about as you go through the whole series, and the information you get there, which leads you deeper in, which it's kind of like a point that leads you deeper into this whole thing, really. It doesn't have that much deep noetic depth on its own. It's just meant to be a relatively decent dungeon.
The fire in Demon Bone Sarcophagus, is it sapient? Do you have interactions or conversations with any individual instantiations of fire or instances of fire?
Yeah, you have like, there's several. There's an ash bird, like kind of like a assistant familiar elemental secretary, which is basic. There's lots and lots of jars of ash scattered around the tomb, and there's one element which is basically a reverse furnace, which is like a giant piece of machine super science, which can take ash, and if you feed in ash, it'll reconstitute whatever the ash used to be. So there's like a library of forbidden knowledge, which is put the ash jars there, and you can try and rebuild it from the jars. There's various different people and tomb gifts which you can reconstitute, and one of them is like a what what do we call it? It's like a secretary bird. It's like a kind of a weird, pompous butler creature, but it's made of ash. And if you heat up the ash on its own, it kind of flows and grows into this creature of like of flowing, moving ash, which may help or hinder you if you can question it. There's another one where it's basically like a philosopher or another tomb guardian who's made of like burning gas. He's literally just a pilot light. So if you open this gas valve and light him, the fire turns into him and you can ask him questions and maybe he'll give you things or not. But if you turn the gas off, he just disappears. He has an object on him, which you can't take because it's made of fire unless you answer his like mysterious questions. Other elements are, since the tomb is meant to be like ancient, much of it is made of like the residuum of fire. There's a creature made of obsidian. There's a witch or a being made of falling leaves who is basically like the fire cycle. It's called broken fire regime. So the fire cycle of fire basically destroying then recreating forests is like an element in the whole series. And this woman is made of like the spirit of the fallen leaves of a forest, which have been bound into individual metal, copper, and gold leaves. And they kind of hang out on an iron tree most of the time, but she can awaken and turn into this terrifying blizzard of like whirling metal death. And there's ice in there as well, and acid, which is another theme later on, because acid and fire both oxidize things. In chemical terms, they're very similar, but at least in terms of like this paracosm, fire is very noble and very fancy and very like Arthurian, and kind of shits all over acid for being, there are creatures called the acid barons, who are basically elementals who are define nobles think of rubbish, even though they both just oxidize stuff. But we're doing the same thing, we're just a liquid. And so they have this kind of deeply resentful relationship with the fire nobles. One of them is imprisoned there. And there are ice demons in there as well, because obviously the reason the last ice age retreated is because a bunch of like fire elementals fought ice demons and won. And then that created the livable world of like the post ice age. So there are some of those locked in there as well.
Picturing the fire as being like sort of the noble king and the acid as being the kind of, you know, like wicked advisor or something like that. You know, who's not
kind of like frustrated nouveau riche, like distant nobility who come into court in their like furs with mud on their boots and who are like, oh, we're here. And then the fire nobles just don't give two shits about them. And this causes massive deep resentment, which again is another Arthurian honor culture thing of like this minor hatred just growing and growing and growing and growing until it forms this massive fissure.
Yeah, getting slighted is a big deal. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Scrap Princess had a more central role in conceptualizing Broken Fire regime than many of your prose projects. Is that correct?
Yes, Scrap did a lot of work on it, especially with the next part, which is Frictionless Blue Glass. That's set inside a giant crater full of this strange unearthly forest, and Scrap loves forests. So Scrap did pretty much created the biological and ecological cycle, which is like the central axis of the whole like epic, and also did all the animals and all the plants and all of the environmental stuff. And there's a group called the Masked Maroons who are like freedom fighters / terrorists / criminals who are opposed to the merchant company Frictionless Blue Glass, and who may or may not be like a distant residuum of the old fire culture. And Scrap did a lot of work on those as well, in like their social status, their way they're set up, their gender series, like the way the genders are arranged, and their materials, tools, and culture and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Before we go on, I just want to say I'm a huge fan of Scrap Princess as well. It's highly fortuitous that you two encountered each other. That's for sure.
I know, right? It's been like I think we've challenged each other quite a bit over the years, but yeah, we have. Hopefully, we've done each other a fair amount of good as well. A strange and unlikely meeting. I guess that's another Arthurian thing where you meet someone in disguise on a road, and they're like, maybe we'll fight each other, maybe we'll team up and fight monsters. Who knows? Or in our case, create monsters.
Yeah. And her RPG content's good too. You know, I like to read her blog. So.
Yes, I think, has that come out yet? Because there's one called New Future, which is basically a cyberpunk thing, but taking into account the nightmare of like the modern cyberpunk version. So you have like guns you have to rent, or like cybernetic garments that want you to like subscribe to their subscription service and stuff like that. And that's, I don't know if it's come out yet, but it should be coming out soon if it hasn't.
Oh Lord, I haven't heard of that. Do you want to say anything else about that, or should we?
I don't know who it's coming up with. I think, oh, I don't know. I don't know what level of like completion it's in right now, or exactly who it's coming out with because I don't remember. I don't want to say anything inaccurate, but it's like a relatively like simple system, but it has like, yeah, as I described, like a post 21st century view of the cybernetic nightmare of corporatization.
Okay. All right. So I want to ask you about your experience with when you were writing Demon Bone Sarcophagus. Is there a trade-off between, did you find that there was a trade-off between euphony and clarity when you were writing, or is that a false dichotomy?
No, it's not a false, it's entirely false, yeah. And euphony within one sentence is relatively easy to do to a medium level. If you want something to be really fancy, then yeah, you're going to have to trade off because of it's very rare you get a very, very euphonically beautiful sentence, which is also very, very clear. So there's like a medium trade-off there, but the main issue with the dungeons and stuff is like clarity, prioritization, what do you put first? In the experience of play, you want every dungeon room to be mysterious, and in the experience of reading it, you want everything to unfold in a certain way, like you want it to like be like a mystery that expands so that people are so engaged in reading it they want to play it or run it later on. But you really don't want that when you're actually running it. When you're actually running it, what you really need is like an old school bear text, where it's like there are 5 orcs in this room, 1 orc is holding a brick, but the same text has to do both things. So going back and forth in prioritization, like you give people a general idea of the room, general idea of the person. Do you give them like the important details first? Like, so we just got feedback for the Demon Bone Sarcophagus. Several of the NPCs have highly complex interrelationships, and there are like multiple conspiracies going on. When you just encounter them, you don't need to know this immediately. What's really important for the DM is just to give you the sensory impression of them, the tone of voice, what it's like being around them. And in case you fight them, you need to know like their basic, what they might do in a dangerous situation. But do you then at some point put in a breakdown of like a simplified and explicit breakdown of what their role in every conspiracy is or might be? Because our last playtest had a lot of trouble working out who was meant to be doing what, who believed what, who had what point of view. It was all seemed reasonable to me when I was writing it, but this is a big problem for me where I maybe make things too complicated. And what seems intuitive and obvious to me often isn't to people playing the game. So I have to work out, do I make things less mysterious and more like open to both the players and the DM, in which case maybe reducing challenge and maybe reducing like the unfolding mystery of events? Or do I keep it more opaque and difficult and therefore make it like a nightmare to run? It's irresolvable polarity between clarity and engagement, I think.
Yeah, it's easy to when you write something, it's easy to think to yourself, this is just going to be fuel for the fire of whoever reads it, really, you know.
Yeah.
Then when you read something, it's very, very easy to think like, you know, what the fuck, like, I need to,
right.
You know?
There are a lot of like dungeons that read very basically, and they read very basic, but run very well. And a lot of my stuff reads very well, but as we've learned, it can be a challenge to deal with at the table. So I'm trying to square that circle to some degree, without just ending up it being like every other product that exists.
Yeah, I've been meaning to go through the 10-foot pole, his list of favorite adventures, and look for the most like just tightly wound traditional adventures possible. Just see what they have to offer, because I don't, you know, like just I haven't really looked into that kind of thing, and just see, you know, in terms of information design or pacing or whatever, just, you know, if they have something to teach. So okay, so I had a question about how Demon Bone Sarcophagus came out of you. Was it like, what degree did it come out whole, and to what degree was it a product of editing?
Oh, the basic concept was relatively simple, and then it's a long, involved and crazy story. So a lot of my stuff takes ages to complete. The idea for what Broken Fire Regime as a whole would be was simple to conceive. You could describe it probably within a handful of paragraphs, but everything beyond that point became nightmarishly difficult because maybe I overwrote. I wasn't really psychologically or intellectually capable of managing the level of complexity I created. it went through multiple potential people who I was shopping around trying to find someone who would publish this giant mess of a book. And I kept having like dramas and negative situations happen. And I kept having like mild meltdowns, which were unrelated sometimes to those. So we basically went up until 2015 with me being hyper-monetarily focused on finishing every different part of it or getting everything up to like some kind of draft level. I think I drove Scrap mad. I nearly drove myself mad. And beyond that point, we were like, okay, I'm having a breakdown. We've failed to bring this to publication multiple times. I'm just going to put this aside for now and try and calm down. So I did that, worked on a bunch of other things, ended up in a more stable situation and went back saying, okay, I think I know how to do it. We're not going to make one giant book or 2 books. We'll make 3 books. Wait, no, I'm not making things more difficult, because if you make 3 books, each book will be relatively small. It'll be about the same size as DCO, and we'll do it year by year. And that way we can manage it between us 2 and it won't drive us insane. And all we need to do is focus on this one chunk and we can get it finished. And so after that, my job was breaking it down into 3 bits and building those bits back up to a functional book, which took a bit of a while. And then after that, it was basically just like we're doing DCO remastered. It was like just the work of like editing and rereading it, taking feedback and working out everything worked, etc., etc. So it's much more procedural. Like the basic concept of these 2 cultures, the corporation and the Arthurian chivalric fire noble, separated by like, and both separated and linked by fire, and how they interrelate and how they could both be tragedies or nightmares depending on what we do. That was like a simple concept. And then beyond that point, it was just a lot of work. It was like years and years of work, and then more years of just not really thinking about it because it was too stressful. It was like, I think since this might be the last massive book I ever do, or the last massive like adventure epic I think I ever do, because it was just too much. It was too much. And since then, I've tried to keep everything smaller.
Right, right. Well, I hope in the process you find, like good people to work with. Your layout, I mean, obviously you already have Scrap publishers and whatnot, so that if in the future you do get the inkling, the groundwork is there, and so it's not quite as much of a torture. That's what I hope. Things
get easier as you go along, I find. As long as you manage not to go completely mad, things do get simpler and more manageable. But it's just trying to stay alive and not lose your sanity on the way there. I can definitely feel I can handle more problems now than I was ever able to when like 5 years ago. 5 years ago, if I'd run into like a lot of difficult feedback or various other problems to do with publishing, I would have like had a breakdown. Whereas now I'm more stable. So I think, yes, thanks to psychology for that, but also thanks to various other life events which have worked out and made the whole OSR scene a bit calmer. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I feel very grateful that I sort of encountered it like after it had kind of simmered a little bit. And then also that I sort of found it after, what's the word? I found both story game stuff and OSR stuff roughly in parallel. And so if there's like a little bit of a travel situation between story game and OSR stuff, I got to just skip that and just maybe take a little bit of the best from each world. Yes, it was a waste of time to be angry at each other and didn't produce anything really good. So it's like, I'm glad that we're either ignoring each other or getting along. Yeah. So you said something in there that kind of lit my brain up, which was how you encounter the situations, and based on what you do, it turns into either a tragedy or it has a potential to be a tragedy or a nightmare. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Well, actually, I was probably being inaccurate, because one of my original desires for BFR, for the whole thing, it was to make something where you could, it was a bad situation, but you could actually win. Or where like a lot of my adventures and stuff have this element where they're quite dark and there are some very unpleasant, and it's like a dark world, but you can actually do something useful. You can maybe help people and produce at least some better effect. So for BFR, I want it to be about renewal. So it is possible, if you play through the whole thing, to some degree amend or make better the situation with the Frictionless Blue class company, and you might be able to save the fire culture in the Palaces of Fire if you're like lucky or clever or just intuitively things go well. So I was wrong. It isn't just a matter of a tragedy or what was my other thing? A nightmare. Although there's it being me writing and Scrap doing it, there's a very good chance that things will go horribly wrong and that things will spiral out of control. And if no one does anything very good, you'll end up with a disaster on your hand. But if you are very clever and have a combination of ruthless problem solving and some degree of moral engagement, you might be able to save everybody, or at least a reasonable number of people.
Sure. Well, I mean, even having the highest victory or best outcome being a 1% chance of, like happening in some way is, when it does happen, it doesn't take away from the meaning of the actual event. So it's just as real, more so. Okay, so so sort of part and parcel with the experience that we just went over, has becoming a full-time author substantially changed the nature of your output, like both your workflow, how you work, and then also what you perceive about the nature of your output?
Yes, substantially. When I wasn't like a professional writer and I had other jobs, and I wasn't also relying on writing or publishing, but it was a lot easier to go really fucking hard on one particular concept for like a long period of time. Because when I was writing Veins, I was at work. I hated my job, so everything I did for Veins was written before work, at lunch breaks, after work, on the bus, in the pub. And every individual part was just me going like as hard as I could for any particular concept and just making it as interesting as I could. And I didn't have any time factor. Like there was no point where I had to produce something by. I was trying to write to escape from my life, but there was no, like, I didn't need to make taxes for next year. I could persist at like a low level for a relatively long period of time. And so while in real terms, I had less time to write, in some ways it was like there was less pressure of a certain kind. And there was a lot of pressure to make something good and interesting and vibrantly, uniquely itself, and a lot less pressure to produce content. Whereas now, I really need to publish something at least once a year. And instead of having like one big thing, instead of having like a crap life that I don't like, I have a life that I actually do like or dislike less. And instead of having one massive project which I can hyper focus on and drive all my energy onto, I almost always have like 2 or 3 or 4 things going on at any particular time. And instead of having to go and sit in a call center and just do a mind-deadening job, which doesn't involve any real intelligence, but just like compresses me down to like a small ball of resentment, I have to do like Kickstarters and publishing stuff and admin, which actually isn't fun, but is like work that I chose. So the whole experience of having like a deadening, soul-crushing job is in some very limited ways almost good for writing, because my brain was basically off for those 6 to 8 hours a day. And when it came back on, you got like a big surge for an hour of just like scribble, 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 write, scribble, 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 write, on the bus, at home, just go to like my room for an hour and write. Because I've been daydreaming all day at work, there was usually something to write, even if it wasn't great. Whereas now it's my job. So I need to wake up and like do an hour thinking about this, I need to get it a little bit further down the line, I need to think of something really good for this. And previously I had no reputation and no one was like, oh, it's a Patrick Stuart adventure. The writing will be good. The game design will be a bit F and the art will be good, but the layout will be a bit rubbish. Before I was just no one, so anything I could do that was good was like a big, like it was great. It was like, here's this guy, no one's heard of him, he's done this book, people really like it. It's like he's come from nowhere. Whereas now it's like, are you as good as Veins of the Earth? Have you improved? Like the adventures more playable? Is your like layout better? Have you dealt with this issue? Have you dealt with that issue? A friend of mine kind of made the point, maybe it was Dave McGrogan, made the point that this hobby industry, where no one made much money, will basically end up pricing itself out of existence. Because if you do something really well, or you're rewarded for it, you want to do the next version better. It's almost impossible to say, yeah, I put the same amount of effort, we didn't really improve things. It's pretty much the same as the last one. You want to at least try and fix things that people thought were bad, or especially if you thought they were imperfect. So You spend more time and resources getting layout good. You spend more time and resources doing playtesting, doing proofreading. But then that's your new normal. And you've done that to yourself, but you've also done it to everybody else in like the society or like the social groups. Now everyone needs to try and get that good. That's good for products, but now it's not a hobby for anyone anymore. Now it's like an actual business. You need this amount of resources to hit like this level where you're like considered to be good enough. It gets harder and harder and harder for a normal person who might have another job to like break in or to produce something at the same level. And I published DCO on Drive-Thru-RPG. It wasn't that different to like a million other adventures that people have published the same way. Whereas now I couldn't really justify to myself producing something like that. It wouldn't match the rest of what I do, and I wouldn't want to do it. So if you're trying to break into the OSR or like the BX Commons or like hipster adventure design, and you've got a job that you rely on, but you also want to do something that's really good, how the fuck could you match something like the original Maze of the Blue Medusa, which had like a really good layout artist, or like Neverland? This guy was Andrew Corbs in this book called Neverland. The content I thought was like okay, but he's an illustrator and he does InDesign and he's the writer and he's the playtester. So it's very, very neatly made, and the balance of image to information to interrelatability is like perfect because he did the whole thing. So how do you match that unless you're also someone who's a writer and an illustrator and you also know InDesign? You can't. So every subculture I fear is in some way on the way to making itself extinct. I hope that I haven't done too much damage to this one. You have to ask Bryce Lynch and his bathysphere dive into like Drive-Thru-RPG if I've helped to ruin things for everybody else.
Yeah, well, here's what I think about that. It's like if you can't do the same thing, that you have once done, there's only one thing to do, which is something new. And so maybe something, a style or a mode or like a movement is like a seam, is like a seam of ore or something that gets mined out and exploited until that possibility space has been explored. But then like it's time for something new that's born of that, maybe born of the energy that's accumulated from tapping that. And so it's like you mentioned arts of D&D or whatnot, or your own like path through these different books. Maybe you feel a little bit of shadow from Veins or the early days or something like that. But I mean, the creative impulse is still there, but the ability is still there, and it's accumulated all of these things. It's like you're mentioning, like, well, how could something like Maze of the Blue Medusa come about at this point? It just seems to me that in any creative or artistic movement, there are locuses of energy in some sense that gather things to them, and that could be a locus of creative energy that brings in people to clad it or structure it in like information design or maps or publishing and things like that. And so it's hard to see from before it happens how something like Maze of the Blue Medusa could be built from whole cloth. But it does happen, ultimately, just as like an irresistible movement forward, when that, I guess, correct creative energy is at the center of it in terms of the writers and the artists. And so I don't know, like, what's going to happen next in terms of, maybe your work in a decade, or, like what people in the current OSR are doing or whatnot. But chances are it's going to transform. But I don't think that there's going to be any ultimate loss of energy in the ecosystem. Probably we're just going to see new blending of things that didn't seem to go together before. Hopefully that'll be
positive. I think I tend to be a bit of a doomsayer, so I'm probably egotistically overrating my importance to the genre. And also, young people will usually find something interesting to do. Like, it's not like they'll think of something, even if however things change, people will still find some way to make interesting stuff. So you're probably right. I should be a bit less self-absorbed and negative. I'm sure future generations will find some way to progress their creative energy. And if they pick up what we did here and turn it into something else, that seems appropriate. Since we just ripped off like the old school sites, like what's the one? There was something called Dragon something. sorry to everyone there, all these old grognards who played with Gary and who knew what real old school D&D was, and we basically just stole all of their rule systems and parts of their aesthetic and just redid a pompous version of it. And I'm sure, hopefully that'll happen to me too one day when someone like just takes everything interesting I've done and does something completely different with it. I can complain on a forum somewhere.
Well, you might be really happy about it. But so here's a question. I don't know what the prose is like in DBS yet, but I wanted to ask you about poetry. It's mysterious in quality, if that's a word, and the way it seems to open a possibility space by leaving the right things like unsketched in DBS. I guess another word for this would be implied world building, and like poetic throwaways that might be that somebody might see and think like, oh, that's an important concept that I want to integrate or work with or something like that. So when you were writing DBS, did you intentionally like mention things but not explain them, or leave things unexplained so that somebody could flesh it out based on its context?
Probably too much. I did that. So Demon Bone Sarcophagus has the entire backstory for the whole saga at the front of the book, and the tomb you go through is the tomb of the Queen of Fire, who is a central character in the social drama which turns up at the end of the book. So you encounter fragments of her personality, her guardians, you find her art and the record of her family, and all of this is based like a giant potential social dramatic mystery that you can maybe put together, but people might not do so. So almost everything you meet with is meant to be this like a record of someone's life or character, but just seen through different aspects. Like this, these are all like, this is a giant pile of shields from all the foes she defeated. Her sarcophagus is literally made of demon bones from demons that she killed. There are the prisoners in here who are creatures so potentially dangerous they couldn't be allowed to die, because if they died, they would end up in the afterlife, and then the forces of evil might get their hands on them. So they're just trapped. Here's like her very questionable mummification specialist. Here's how she felt about her family, who she lost. There are all these like records, statues, archives, and bits and pieces which tell you about her and what happened to her. But I wonder if I've gone too hard on it, and it's just like no group of players would ever put all this together or necessarily want to. I'll have to see how it plays, both with playtesters and just with like the wider culture and how people generally play it. You don't absolutely need to, but it's all there.
Right. So, well, then what elements of it, or are there elements of it, or what elements of it do you like personally most want people to experience? Like, are there any sections of it that are really close to your heart, and that if you could pare it all down and give people like a 20-minute experience, are there any parts of it that are like that for you?
Yes, but I can't tell you in detail without giving the whole arc of the series away. So the Queen of Fire had a complex relationship with her spouses or partners who were fire nobles. Things went horribly wrong, and she lost her children, or some of her children, and she has on her book, like the treasure you find in the Demon Bone Sarcophagus is her personal effects, including her wedding ring, which is literally a ring of fire. And in the last part of the book, you go to the palaces of fire and you meet these people. For us, it was like thousands of years ago, but for them, it was like 30 years ago. So her surviving children and her ex-partners and their family are all there. And my idea for a major scene was like, you turn up in like the plane of fire and you meet these people. And one of them says, "That's my wife's ring. I gave that to my wife. What the fuck are you wearing it?" And you're like, "Oh, she died thousands of years ago, and we invaded her tomb, and we took it out of respect." And he's like, "Where are my children?" Like, "Oh, they also died thousands of years ago, but they left a mighty culture behind them." And it's like, I don't know what anyone would do or say in those situations or how people would respond. I just wanted to see what happened, basically. Because for them, it's like a traumatic recent family event, but for you, it's like ancient history, but now it's real. And it's like, Another thing Dave McGrone said to me is like, you're digging up bodies and invading tombs and getting stuff. You're basically digging with someone's mortal remains. If they died like yesterday or 1,000 years ago, that's someone's life. But for us, there's like if it's like 1,000 years ago, we're like, okay, it's history. But what if it wasn't history anymore? And it's like, you broke into my wife's grave. Why did you do that?
Yeah.
And like, how can you explain it? Also, you have information that those people would need and would change their point of view, and they have information which completely changes your view of what you've already found. So this connection through time, I just wanted to see what would happen and across different people playing it, different people experiencing it, and how different personalities or groups of players would just like maybe produce completely different results.
Yeah, I can completely see that. Oh man. So I want to ask you about art in the tomb, and also in the possession of the merchants, if there is anything. Like, have you been putting together art sort of like what you had on the back of a civilipede, the great list? Also, this is sort of important for the palaces of fire because they're probably bathing in art, and maybe for thieving in bluegrass as well.
Yes, it's okay. So you're right. These noble cultures do love art, and yes, it is very hard to fucking work out what kind of art fire and metals would have and how you can make that tangible for normal people. But yes, the tomb has a bunch of like friezes. It has flame paintings, which are basically made of these like dioramas or mosaics of different kinds of material, which are on fire at super slow time, and the fire that's coming out of them has been sculpted into the image. So if you mess with them, they can go off like bombs. It also has these like books of like, has the books made of ash, which you can reconstitute. It has other books made of ceramic. It has like a book of sapphire leaves. It has like these orbs, which are also made of like slow time. They're like the tiny nuclear explosions. If you've seen like a fusion reactor or a nuclear reactor going off, it forms this beautiful orb of conflicting and interacting energies. It's like those, but they're, again, slowed in time and turned into objects. It has some of the automata or has the clothing. We need to redo the clothing, but she's a fire queen. She's meant to have like very good sense of style. So she has a bunch of like highly ritualized objects made of rare materials, obviously, and also it has like the hobbycraft area of her ex-spouses who were into different things and who had like built weird machines that did impossible things that are impossible in this reality. And it has a few like personal shocks which are based around her like family relationships. Once you go to the Palaces of Fire, again, it's hard to make things. One of the things you find in the Palaces of Fire is that a crackpot scientist figure has a massively reinforced bathysphere fish tank with actual physical water in it and actual fish. But on that plane, that's so dangerous and so weird. It's like having a fucking antimatter in a cage. When you go to the plane of fire, you get translated and transformed into a different, your flesh literally gets changed. So you become a bit like a fire creature, almost like a candle flame or like a lantern glowing from the inside. So any actual solid material that maintains its status and goes to the plane of fire either melts, burns, or has to be dangerously contained, because there it's massively unstable matter. Stuff on the plane of fire is literally made of fire. The trees are like made of fireworks. The grass is candle flame, made of candle flames. Like the buildings are made of like the wave fronts of explosions or burning furnaces and stuff like that. And so the stuff those people own either has to be made of these weird magical materials, so it's sealed by magic, or it's super stable, or it's literally made of bits of fire or bits of like different kinds of conflagration. Like some of their furniture is made of like the ghosts of furniture from burning buildings. So if you imagine a building burning down and this really beautiful mahogany chair being almost completely annihilated, and it's in the act of dying, so it's part of it's still good, the fire is consuming it and part of its ash has fallen away, but in their case, the fire will have frozen into like upholstery and they'll just use it as a real chair. But trying to come up with stuff like that is a challenge and remains a challenge. The Frictionless Blue Glass Merchant Company basically has mediocre corporate art and shitloads of money. So the main thing in there is one of the things we hope people want to is rob from their central vault. And that vault is full of the titular frictionless blue glass, which is very valuable and light, but also all of their actual physical money. So it's like stealing from Fort Knox. And because their corporate structure has no real personality, the only things they have as treasure are just industrial products, drugs, which are the products of crime, strange materials from the zone they're exploiting, and like they've been robbing the tombs of the culture of fire and basically destroying the memory of them. So they have bits and pieces of that culture, but they're not like held in an understood or comprehended way. They're held as kind of like victory symbols of this annihilating system, destroying and reducing it and basically turning it from a potential culture into a museum piece. So they're held in this kind of slightly kind of ritualized and enhanced, also degraded. They've become simple like artifacts, like pen holders or like paperweights. But most of the treasure you would find, like in Frictionless Blue Glass, water is a treasure because the company inhabits like a very waterless zone and has artificially destroyed every well apart from one or two. So they control the entire supply of water. So you're basically close to dying of thirst all the time you're there, and you need water to survive. They control it. To pay for it, you need company script, which isn't worth anything anywhere else. To get company script, you need to do work for the company, steal it, steal water, or literally become like a debt peon who harvests this material they need. So your treasure in there is basically rope. Oh, nothing really works very well. So the only items you can buy are, unless you're like high-level security staff, are like shitty rope, shitty pots and pans, shitty things that break really easily because they just need people to keep coming back to the company store to buy more stuff. So like having a decent weapon is treasure there, and people will try and steal it from you because it's not going to break immediately. And the company will actually pay you a lot of money for your good quality stuff. So if you're in debt or you need stuff, they can be like, well, I'll buy that sword off you for Frictionless Blue Glass. Like, that's great. But then they won't give it back. And they'll be like, well, we can lend you a sword or a machete made of bamboo. You don't even need to pay for it. You can borrow the money. So they'll lend you money to buy stuff from them, and the interest rates are extortionate. And to pay off the interest rates, you need to work for them in doing various things. So it's basically a nightmare debt trap in which nothing functions very well. There's loads of rules and security rules, which if you break, you can be fined for it, but you can't do the jobs they ask you to do and obey all of their security safety rules. So you're going to have to lie and scheme or be fined again deeper into the debt trap. So yeah, you're only survived this crime, basically.
Right. So I was going to ask you if there was a way, or if you were envisioning the players getting integrated into the system on their way to heisting it or something like that.
Yes. You have two options, basically. There's like I don't know if this will be in the finished version, but the original concept is like a solidarity index. And depending on the actions you take place, you can change the society that makes up the zone. So depending on who you side with and what actions you do, you can kind of light the flame of a potential revolution or a rebirth of like humanity. But that can lead to chaos and destruction, and it makes dealing with the company almost impossible. So you're basically like a bandit revolutionary who's like biting rats to survive. But you can also work for the company and do what they want you to do, and you can get promoted deeper and deeper into the company if you keep doing stuff. If you perform enough actions that are useful to them and that basically put you so far outside the moral pale that no other faction will deal with you, you can go all the way to the top. But of course, if you do those things, effectively, it would be easier for you to just carry on running the company than to rob them, because now you're so deeply enmeshed with them. You receive so many privileges and so much money from them. If you actually do rob their vault, you're stealing from yourself, really. So maybe you should just become like the company's new executive. And then now you are the Frictionless Blue Glass Merchant Company. And that's a possibility, although I don't think many players would take it, but it's in there in the original concept of the book.
Boy, I really like that. That's like that's sort of like the implied promise of a cyberpunk campaign or something like that. Is you're in this great, like totalitarian, not totalitarian, but you're in this great corrupt system. So you can be a complete bandit, and live out that wild fantasy, without feeling like a completely bad guy for fucking up a society that's in homeostasis. But on the other hand, there's also this like world of, like immense power and wealth. And if, you want to go into that mannered, like arena, but then there's also, like the path of being the wild reaver and all that stuff. That's super cool.
What happens to adventurers in real life, which is they end up running the East India Company and they're not adventurers anymore because they succeeded. They're like Robert Clive or that Dutch guy, where it's like they die bloated and wealthy in some mansion, hating themselves, probably drunk, but they run the game that they assigned themselves.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you if you give them the chance, most parties will like try and turn into an empire if they can. As long as it's theirs, as long as they're not doing it on behalf of somebody else. They'll be the enemies of mankind. That's for sure. Okay, so I'm curious about something, which is how does this is just a minor thing, but how does the battle open the holes? Like the battle when Demon Bone Sarcophagus starts, how does it open the holes into the tomb itself? Is it magic or erosion, some kind of technology?
There are glass girls. One of the merchants who is part of this catastrophe, the reason he's there is because he transports acid to the merchant company. For complex reasons which will become evident, this acid is in the form of golems, which can transport themselves, and in the form of these glass girls. So what happens is you have an accident and his like crates break open, some smash, which is disastrous, and these naked women made of glass full of acid start wandering across the countryside, and he's trying to get them back, but his methods for doing so have been restricted or damaged. So this acid is intensely, overwhelmingly dangerous. So if you try, it's also valuable. If you can grab one of these glass girls and control them and take it to the merchant company, they'll pay you a lot of money for the acid inside, but it's a golem made of glass and it's full of acid. So if one of them falls, it goes like the fucking xenomorph from Aliens and it burns a hole in whatever it is. If you're just on the ground, it'll burn a pit in the ground or damage the earth. But if you happen to be standing above a buried tomb and one of them falls over, it'll go crash, psh, don't be near it because you'll lose a leg, but then it'll melt through and open a hole into this underground space you didn't know was there. There's also a giant sloth which bursts up out of the ground. Over the years, the tomb is basically indetectable to magic, so no one can find it. But this giant sloth, which doesn't know about magic and couldn't sense it anyway, has basically been burrowing around inside the tomb, breaking up into its rooms, breaking back down, and messing the whole thing up and causing subsidence. And then as the battle takes place and these factions start fighting, or they're about to fight, this sloth is like, what the fuck's going on above me? And just bursts up out of the ground. And it's like the famous story of the meeting between armies where a guy is bitten by a snake and draws a sword to kill it. And the other side is like, he's drawing swords, we need to fight. And then the whole thing just goes completely to shit. So the sloth tunnels also interconnect all the rooms as well as other things.
Okay. So that leads me into my next question, which is about your conceptualization or the inspiration for the opening, like not implied, but at least in the backstory, the opening scene. Like I don't want to paint it into a corner as being like a particular esque, but two words have been coming to mind, and now a third word. The first word was McCarthy-esque. The second word was Tarantino-esque.
Oh yeah, I completely rip off both of those. I think in my original description, I was trying to describe it as like, it's like the beginning of No Country for Old Men. Like, it's like that basically. And it is, I didn't consciously draw on Tarantino, but yeah, it's like, it is like the start of a Tarantino movie, but it's too weird and complex because it might be too complex for players. I don't know. We'll have to see again how it plays out with different groups.
It's the third word I was going to say, maybe Cohen-esque.
Yes. Yeah. It's an accident, these groups, but it might not be a complete accident, and no one knows what's going on in total, and so things go completely to shit for everybody. And everybody who came there had a plan, had a secret, but the interruption of every other group, plus the giant sloth, plus these girls made of acid, plus the tomb, it's just like, what the fuck do we do? And the catastrophe that breaks out leaves everyone deeply, deeply confused because everyone has like mixed. They're all related to the Blue Glass Merchant Company in the zone somehow, but they all have like different kinds of loyalty and intermix and are afraid and want to group up or not with other people. And so while the players don't know what's happened, all the people they meet will also be confused. They'll not all have fragments of information. They'll know about some of the conspiracies and some of like who some people are, but they won't understand the whole thing. So it's to find out and understand what happened. The players will either have to be very clever and cunning and speaking to a wide range of people who are different loyalties, or just have a shitload of speak with dead spells and go through the entire bodies and be like, what were you doing? Can you give us your background? And you, and you, and you, which is something you can't do in a Cormac McCarthy book.
Yeah. Speak with dead. That's gonna be one of my favorite spells. And so the heists. Okay, so we got sort of either an explicit or implied heist in Demon Bone Sarcophagus when you get the merchants, and then the Frictionless Bluegrass. That was actually not intentional. Blue glass is a heist, and then maybe there's some heisting that's going to go on in Palaces of Fire too, because you're in a place that's pretty ripe for plunder. So, yes. Like, what brought you, or what was the process of coming to, I want to do some heists now?
I think I've described it. I've never done one before, and my core idea was like, wouldn't it be really cool if we had this encounter, and one of the main treasures for it was like this really well-developed heist? Because one of the problems with doing a heist in D&D is like the planning has to be deeply complex. So you either have to rely on people to do that complex planning on their own, which many groups will do, or you have to kind of divide up the plan amongst different places so they can put it together on their own. Or you basically do a story game where a lot of the complex layer of the planning is taking part of, like the narrative aspects. But in this, so I tried to do an OSR version, which is basically someone's already developed this complex plan and gives you all the security arrangements, some ideas about what to do and what the threats will be. They haven't solved every problem, but it's like a lot. So it tells you where to go, what the security will be, who's guarding it, their like patrol patterns, ideas about who you need to meet up with to get out. And so it gives you like a nice, neat set of information. And the idea is at the start, you get a chunk of this plan, which someone's torn off, and it's enough to tell you what it is and give you something. And you think, and then hopefully in Demon Bone Sarcophagus, people will chase the plan and recover it. And then if we actually produce it as a physical object, the DM will be able to give it to the players and say, here's the actual plan of the heist, here's the vault plans and everything. And in the next book, we will go to Frictionless Blue Glass and you will be able to try to carry out this heist if you want to. That was the idea. Whether we'll be able to pull it off in game design or publication terms, I don't know. You'll have to wait for like 2 or 3 years to see if we can do it, but that's the ambition.
Right. So I was gonna ask you about how you structured a heist in the first place in the game, but it sounds like you did something which makes sense to me now that I hear it, which is like taking a lot of the legwork that might be interesting in real life, but wouldn't necessarily be that interested in an RPG, like stick. Yeah.
Sorry, hey, Amazon man, you can cut that out.
It's all good. I'm okay. Anyways, so I was gonna ask you how you structured the heist, and like also the company and the environment with the heist in mind in the first place. But it sounds like you did something which makes sense in retrospect, which is taking a lot of the bitch work, a lot of the leg work, and sketching it out ahead of time so that the players don't have to sit on stakeouts or break into like municipal records offices unless they want to get like the layouts of certain floors and things like that. So that makes sense. So you're down to the execution and of course the adaptation once things go off the rails. So that makes sense. Do you want to say anything about like?
Yeah, I basically did a procedural thing where I was like, if I was this company and I had a shitload of money in this environment, how would I protect it? And so I built it's right at the center of the corporate controlled zone, which is right at the center of the crater. The entire refinery is like curled around it like a dragon. And it's blocked off by the headquarters of the entire company, which is also inhabited by mercenaries on the bottom floor. It's like literally physically surrounded by the corporation in every conceivable way. And then there's added security inside. So to get inside, you would need to do a crazy level of bullshit. But then to try and get out of the zone, how would you do that? Because it's like a not deliberately kept a nightmare to navigate. And you're presumably going to be trying to carry treasure. So maybe you need to set up some kind of catastrophe or form some kind of alliance with people. the idea was, even if people are completely old school, and they just want the gold, they're probably going to have to destroy the company on some level, or set up some kind of civil war, or like do something terrible just to get the gold out, just to get the money out. So you're going to end up involved in politics, whether you want to or not, just as like, no matter which direction you attack it from.
I mean, I guess that is part of the pleasure of a dystopia, is, being just okay to tear it down if you need to. Get some get some booty out of it. So so when you actually transition from the tomb to dealing with the merchants, what does that feel like, or what should it feel like? Like, I picture like once you've gotten through the tomb, which is probably a dangerous place, like a special extra tricky bonus round where you've got this opportunity for lots of cash, but maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's like an integral and expected like stage of the adventure. So what's the tonal shift? What's the shift in how the party needs to be conducting themselves? Most likely, what do you think about that? Or
it's not in this book. That takes place almost entirely in the second book, Frictionless Blue Glass, and it's like an entire area. So the idea is you go through the tomb. It's like a pretty standardish dungeon crawl, but with these extra parts added. Hopefully, you come out with a lot of information about the merchant company. Hopefully, you have the vault plans, or at least you know about them. You know at least some of the conspiracies inside the company, and you know a bit about the fire culture and what happened there. And so you go, there's like the zone where their plantation is, and it's controlled by them. The vault is in the middle, and that's also used to be the ancient zone that was controlled by the fire culture. So all their old tombs are there. So that's basically a geographical area where you go to it, and it's like this gigantic 3-mile radius crater, which has been colonized by this life that these biome that doesn't exist anywhere else. And inside it's like a nightmare caustic. It's basically like a rainforest over a caustic maze inhabited by a terrifying corporation, which sends out people every morning to kind of wind their way through the pathways to climb these gigantic cloud grave trees and to harvest the overwhelmingly dangerous sap at the top, trying to avoid the nightmare life that inhabits pretty much every level, to bring it back down safely, and then before it settles, bring it back to the central refinery and get paid enough for them to survive for another day. And so the security for them is basically the nightmare they've created around themselves. It would be a hard place to survive even without the corporation being involved. It would be like a very, very hot, very dry forest where there's very little water, lots of dangerous life forms, and very few resources, which is also a nightmare to navigate. And there's like an evil corporation at the center who send out security groups, and everyone, whether they wish to or not, works for this corporation because they have the water and the money, and they're the reason everything's there. So you're surrounded by these people, average workers, who, can you trust them? What do they want? Do they want to join your cool revolution? Do they want to help rob the company? Are they just afraid of the company? Are they just genuine loyalists? Because there's meant to be like a curve in the population of people who, some people are kind of like you, they're quasi-player characters, and you'd be say, do you want to do some schemes? They'll be up for it. But most people just want to get through their day. And there's a hardcore of people who are kind of adapted to this and who like it and who think it's good. They're the ones who are really good harvesters. Like, they got promoted to security, they got promoted again to like executive, and it's like they're genuinely trying to protect the system because for them it's been very good. So this whole culture, in a sense, is your enemy. And how do you defeat its security, and how do you actually kind of like wind your way through it without alerting it to your presence? Is like the problem of the second book.
Right. And even somebody at the very bottom could say, these guys are not going to succeed in their fucking quest here, but I could get some extra food or some extra money or something like that by reporting them. So
exactly, yeah. And they'd be afraid if you were caught, and if they didn't report you, someone's going to be knocking at their shack door being like, we heard you met with these distant elements. And you can change the tenor of the society inside the creator zone, ideally. Hopefully it will still be there when we finish the book, by performing actions or performing things that raise a level of solidarity and kind of mutual confidence. And you can slowly chip away and destroy the atomization, loneliness, and low-level terror that keeps people separate and afraid. And they can form a kind of quasi-society that would be more receptive to potentially overthrowing the company. Or you can go the other way and just make it even worse, but gain status with the company and get closer and closer to the vault that way.
Right. I like that. So here's an emergent question. So I like systems or outcome possibility schemes where both the absolute, where something like genuinely meaningfully good and then also absolute catastrophe where everything's wrecked forever are possible, you know, like within the outcome table. And and so I like that it's possible to shift the dial on the society if that's what you decide to do, and that's what you're successful in doing. When, you know, things that have to go, have to succeed. So how did you shift from maybe like a slightly different orientation in earlier books, like say Veins of the Earth? You've got the non-men, you've got the fellows who are good, but then, you know, they're sort of like hiding out, and everybody else is, by our standards, anyways, pretty fucked up. And then DCO, where you're like observing this environment, and like the outcome, it's not simple to get like a super positive outcome. But now you've got, and it's not simple in this either, but now it seems like my impression is your orientation for this has shifted such that now it's possible to actually have not necessarily likely, but possible to have a positive effect by the end of it, on what's going on. So what's shifted in your approach to creating adventures or your world orientation?
I just come off doing Veins and DCO, and I did, well, partly, you're right, Veins is like basically about surviving horrible stuff, and it's basically surviving entropy, and DCO is like, if you do the right thing, you can stop things from getting very worse, but they're still going to be bad. And this one is deliberately selected because I wanted to write something that had more hope in it, and it fit with the element in question, which is fire. Fire is, in almost every case, related to transformation and destruction. So things might be destroyed and things might be transformed. It could be transformed in a very good way or a very bad way, but whatever happens, things are going to be transformed throughout the adventure. So it fit that this was a situation where you could genuinely change things, and where things would change regardless of what you did, but you could affect it. It's all like the moral scheme of the adventure is related directly to the element, right? More so, I think, with Veins. Veins was more about procedurally imagining nightmare societies with like low resources and being super ancient, and then working out what that would be like, and deep time, so stasis. And I wanted to do a book about fire, transformation, change, possibility, maybe hope, and so built that into the structure of the adventure from like Frictionless Blue Glass onwards.
Right, fundamentally just different context. So I wanted to ask that because it came up in my mind, but also, so a lot of players will not surrender, like unless they're 90% fucked already. They're very proud, and so I'm picturing, like, you know, the system of going out and climbing the trees, you know, and the harvesting zone and whatnot. That's something that could be interesting for a player to experience. But like, you know, maybe they would do it as part of the infiltration. Do you picture, if players are captured by the company, that they would be forced into that kind of peonage, into that serf role?
I have no idea, but it's a possibility. And if you're really good at it, you can escape the debt trap if you're very lucky. It's like, it wouldn't suit the corporation's need to have it be an inevitable doom. Like, my idea is like, there are people queued up outside this area trying to get in to get work, because they know as much as many people die or get injured or just disappear every couple of days, there's like a trickle of people who come out saying, I've made enough money to buy my power, or I've had this level of success. They're kind of fucked up with like limbs burnt off and scarification, and they've been bitten by one of these panther creatures, but they're like, got my gold. So you can, in theory, win. Like, if you're a really top performer, you can win at this corporate nightmare. I have no idea what players will do. I'm really interested to find out if you offer people the possibility of like, do you want to become a plantation worker and just get really good at that? And you can make money and therefore XP doing that. Hopefully the process of harvesting is interesting enough and dangerous enough that every tree is like a little procedural dungeon and it can kill you. So you basically have to find a tree that hasn't been harvested recently, which is like navigating this nightmare labyrinth of jungle and stone. To climb to the top of the tree, they're insane. They're like very, very, very tall. You have to climb through the foliage, and you have to have a team at the top and a team at the bottom. At various, like the crown level of the tree has its own biosphere, and they have like weird creatures there that might attack you. The bottom layer has its own biosphere. There are creatures, but also people might try and steal your harvest, or you might get harassed by security goons, or any other kind of thing might happen. And the groups are separate, linked by a rope. So like you can be in the top saying there's like, there's maroons attacking you, they're in the bushes, and they can't hear you downstairs. Or you could be like the first thing you could hear about a problem at the top is like someone just plummets out the sky covered in blue goo. But if you get to the center of the tree at the top of the crown, you can harvest this incredibly valuable sap. Don't get any on you because it doesn't come off ever. The only way to get off is with acid, which will also scar you. So everyone who does this job ends up with like these blue splatters all over their body, which are unique stains. And if you fall in, that's it, I'm afraid. You're just going to be a sap mummy. And some of the trees have sap mummies in the center of the thing, which is like a harvester fell in there. So you get this dangerous liquid. You try and lower it back down the tree to your friends without spilling it on them. If you can get it back down, then you climb down, then it'll be close to night. So you have to run, but don't spill the liquid back to the refinery. Don't lose your way either or get attacked. You have to join the refinery queue, which is its own little polity where people will stab and murder each other or like promise schemes to get closer to the refinery gate. And if you reach the refinery gate before the sap has set, you can trade it in for company scrip and then use that to buy what you need. And if you do that well, you can, by company standards, end up rich. And if you do it poorly, you just end up getting deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. So if you adopt like an old school player character approach to that, they might be very good at it. If you just like they might just try and heist other harvesters or like join a crime group and just do stuff like that, or just go to the queue and threaten to, like box someone off and threaten to stab them unless they give up their sap, and then you just don't need to do anything. There are ways to hack the system if you're evil. So I don't know. This might be completely fucking insane to like do a plantation series where you can do the heist, but you can also join the company or join the terrorists / freedom fighters, or just harvest the sap if you want to, and they're all part of the adventure. I don't know if we'll have room for it in the book or if we can make it work, but we'll try.
I like that a lot. It's like, finally, I've got a use for my high con. And you see the guy with the high jaw over there trying to schmooze the guards, but that guy still has to survive the day. So,
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I like mini games like that. You know, it's not exactly a mini game because you're not just rolling for an outcome. It's like stage. Got to get there, got to get back. I like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's see. Have you concocted any new spells for Demon Bone Sarcophagus or this series, you know, in the vein of the Speleo spells?
Oh, I don't think I have yet. Demon Bone Sarcophagus, there's just some magical effects, but they're mainly related to monsters, I think. So hopefully one of the options for the Kickstarter is that we do the Feast of Bukaku for the new spells, and hopefully going to turn those magical effects into spells that you can produce on your own. And also there are multiple spell books in the adventure which we haven't finalized yet. So if we don't have the time or we don't reach our targets, we'll just fill those with rewrites of standard D&D spells. But if we do, then we'll do like genuinely new spells which fit the theme of the individual characters who have those books. So there should be new ones there.
Okay, so I got a last question here, which is about the history of the Queen of Fire. And recall that her story is sort of central to all of this, to a Broken Fire regime in general. And so I was wondering if you could tell us anything about writing the history of the Queen of Fire, or anything that we can look forward to in that.
I don't know how much I can tell you because you're meant to find out in the books, but it's basically like a sad, how can I describe it? It's the creation of like a noble class in deep history that basically this tribal leader, she's fighting ice demons. It's the Ice Age. She's trying to keep her people alive. And from her perspective, a bunch of weird fire elemental people turn up who also tend to be pretty hot, like in every sense of the word. And they end up in a relationship, and together with her like being an ultimate primal Conan style badass, and them being literally made of fire and having magic, and also being like having a knightly culture, they team up and defeat the ice and defeat the ice demons, seriously piss off the acid barons in the process. But then, because her like family, or if the fire noble's biggest flaw is their like sense of their own purity. So from their perspective, their distaff members are banging some half-solid wench who's not even made of a pure element, but just like this mess of mud and gristle. And so they don't recognize her validity or the validity of her children. She's like an extreme type A personality. She's not happy about that. And then things go disastrously wrong across a variety of levels, leading to cataclysm. But all this happens in the deep past, and then later on, the Fire Queen builds the Empire of Fire, or continues building it, dies, presumably fighting demons, and is like buried with the most dangerous creatures, the ones she couldn't even allow to die because they would go to hell. And then you basically fall into a tomb and start fucking up everything around it.
All right. Well then, that's good. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss? Any subjects about it that you'd like to bring up?
Oh no, I don't think so. It's been pretty full discussion. It's been quite fun though. So thank you.
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun. All right, thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'm going to end the recording.